As we have come to appreciate in this course, it is hard to overestimate the importance of empathy in the design process. Our guest today has worked to expand our understanding of just what that means. Galen Cranz is professor of architecture at the University of California at Berkeley, a PhD sociologist from the University of Chicago, and a certified teacher of the Alexander technique. She teaches social and cultural approaches to architecture and urban design. Emphasizing ethnography as a research method, she brings users as well as creators' perspectives to our understanding of built environments and includes the point of view of different American cultures. In 2011, she received the Career Award, the highest award of the Environmental Design Research Association, or EDRA. Professor Cranz is also the author of The Chair, Rethinking Culture, Body, and Design, which received EDRA's 2004 Achievement Award. She has lectured widely on her perspective on body-conscious design and taught her unique approach at craft schools, including the Pendleton School of Crafts, the Oregon College of Arts and Crafts, Anderson Ranch Art Center, and Domus Academy of Design in Milan, Italy. Her research on The Chair has attracted media attention from the New York Times, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, San Francisco Chronicle, among many others. She is a co-principal investigator and recipient of the Latrobe Fellowship for Architectural Research to study evidence-based hospital lighting and design with Kaiser Permanente Hospitals and Gordon Chong Architecture. As a designer, she has been part of significant park design competition teams for Spectacle Island here in Boston, in the Inner Harbor, Olympia Fields in Chicago, and Bernard Shumi's Parc La Villette in Paris, and a lead designer for and winner of the St. Paul Cityscape competition of 1984. She holds 2 U.S. patents for body-conscious bathtub and chair designs. In 2005 to 2007, she designed and built a residence for the elderly following universal design principles. Please join me in welcoming Galen Cranz. Welcome.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi. Do you hear me? Shall I pull this a little closer? Yes. Hi. Well, I want to share with you my approach today, which starts out being about chairs, but broadens to become about what I'm calling body-conscious design, taking into account the fact that we have these lovely bodies. And this is just to show you that it is a sexy topic, even though you might not have realized it. Here is what happens in a typical chair. And I read an article years ago, decades ago, that was explaining why. Actually, I don't have to stay with this thing, do I? Because I can walk around. Is this? It should be up, and it's working. Ah, great. Okay, great. So I can walk around a bit. So, in fact, do we have a pointer? This article that I read said that there are twin forces set into play when we lean back on a chair back. That we go back, but then that makes us slide down and forward. And so, when we do that, the pelvis slides more and more forward on the chair. And pretty soon you're way out here like this. We've all been there, right? And, oh, I see that.
You have a pointer and you can advance it.
All right. Okay, thank you. The pointer is here. Good. So you're now reversing your lumbar curve. You know, this part now is starting to bend backwards where it should go really far forward. So pretty soon, after you've hung out here for a while, you realize this isn't good, and you scoop. You sit. Your pelvis has slid out to the edge. You sit up at that point. Then the article says, but after a while, the back needs support, so you scoot back and you start the process all over again. And so I thought, well, that means chair design isn't really a very rational topic. So we should just play with it and have fun artistically, using decoration, all that kind of stuff. But then I trained to become a teacher of the Alexander Technique. How many have heard of the Alexander Technique? Anybody ever heard of it? One person. It's a system of posture and movement developed by an Australian 100-some years ago. And as I started to study this, and it's a 3-year training program, I began to realize that there was a cultural assumption built into this idea that we cannot sit upright unassisted without needing back support. Because when you look around, of course, other cultures do sit without chairs. Now, admittedly here, the Buddha is in stone, so he's not going to have any back problems. But it is true that cultures sit without the benefit of chairs. In Asia and also in Africa, this painting, picture I took myself in Egypt. And of course, Japan, famous for its tatami mats. So I began to wonder, well, if some cultures do chair sitting and some don't, where did the chair sitting come from? And the furniture historians will usually take you back to these Assyrian kings, or there should be a nice pharaoh there, yeah, or the pharaohs, and that would get us to about 2,500 years ago. And so this is Egypt, this is the Mesopotamians, and so I thought, well, gosh, those are two very complex societies, Mesopotamian and Egypt. Was there anything before that? So I started nosing around in the archaeology department, and I asked people about it, and they said, oh, we've never thought about the origin of chairs. But one woman said, oh, there's a recent find in the former Yugoslavia of these kiln-fired figures that are found only in female graves. And they're about this big, and they have four legs, and there's a scoring mark right there. See that scoring mark? That separates the back of the chair from the body. They're only of women, and they're only in women's graves. But the interesting piece of news is these are from 7,500 BC. So that doubles the life of chairs. And we may never know exactly where they came from, because our evidence from, this is Neolithic life, Neo meaning New Stone Age, and Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, it's 40,000 BC. Mostly what we know there is from cave paintings, and mostly what's depicted there are animals, very less often a human, and even less often a tool, but never a chair or a stool or any kind of seating implement. So we may never know exactly where chairs originated, but I think what we can say is that they seem to have some connection with status. Notice it was the pharaoh and the king, and now only women and only in women's graves. So there's some kind of what we would sociologists call role differentiation at work here. So I think we still have that with us today, because if you want to be polite to somebody, you offer them a seat, right? Have a seat, the secretary says, when you're waiting to see somebody. And if you don't offer somebody a seat, that's considered rude. If you go in for a job interview, you have no problem knowing where you're supposed to sit, whereas the boss is sitting. At Thanksgiving, there might be a set of chairs around a dining room table, and maybe one of that set has arms. Are those arms for the weakest person in the family? The elderly frail who might need to get a little extra push up out? No, it's for the so-called head of household. So status is still with us in our thinking about chairs. And I think it's partly why we have not been able to think rationally about the issue of chair design. And I'm going to invite you to, how come this guy doesn't want, oh, I see, okay. So Greece now becomes kind of close to us compared to these Neolithic villages. And there's an invention of a new chair type called the klizmos, with its curved legs that swoop up into a curved back. And furniture historians like this. They say it's an example of relaxation. as an Alexander trained person, I would say it's an official example of slumping. Those pharaohs sat upright, not because their artists couldn't depict uprightness. I mean, their stonework is fabulous. If you've ever, when you get to go to Egypt someday, if you haven't, you'll see the fish carved into the stone. They look like they're swimming. Their artists are so good. So it wasn't something about that they couldn't depict ease. It was that the pharaohs had a job, which is to connect to the higher forces of the universe. And I don't know of any meditation tradition in the world that says it's okay to slump if you're trying to connect to higher consciousness. Somehow we are a bit like antenna, and if we're going to get up there, this brain and nerve system and spinal cord doesn't do so well when it's like this. Okay, Romans brought us another piece of furniture. In architecture, we'd say building type. We never say furniture type, do we? Isn't that interesting? But it did bring us a new type, which was basically a pallet or this bed where social life is conducted. Even if you're poor, you had a stone one with just straw on it. This is obviously a rich person's. This is a special thing from Roman life, too. It's called the triclinium. Tri, three-sided. And it's for banquets. So you bring in big cushions, and you have 3 people here, and 3 people here, and 3 people here, and their heads are all here. The food server brings in the food here and sets it on this ledge, the wine and the food and so forth. Servants and women would sit on stools nearby. Later, that changed, but anyway, it's a lie-down way to eat. And so, in fact, the Last Supper would have been conducted in a triclinium. And I'm told by biblical scholars that the language of so-and-so lay in the bosom of so-and-so only makes sense if you assume it's in a triclinium. But as our culture became a chair and table culture, our artists changed the depiction of this event into a chair and table event, which it was not. Now, supposedly, we are told that during the so-called Dark Ages, everything collapsed, and there was no interest in furniture or much of anything else. And so furniture got reinvented in the early, like in the 1300s. And once again, it's reinvented with the king getting to be elevated, whereas the commoners are all there on the ground. And here, in fact, is an early throne from like about 1300. Another influence on the redevelopment of the chair is the feudal manor. People kept all their possessions in boxes or around the manger hall in a feudal home so that they could leave and take their stuff with them because of either political instability, wars, or because they had to administer lands maybe 100 miles away. So everything had to be pack-upable. And to me, this chair looks an awful lot like a box pushed up against a wall. Another influence that took me quite a while to figure out, sorry, this is not a perfect slide. I took it myself in the Glasgow Museum of what's called a misericord. It's used in choir stall in churches where they would sing these very long events called misericords, 5 to 6 hours. Well, how many of you here are singers? And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, is it possible to sing well seated as you are? No, I won't make you say it. When you sit at this right angle, your diaphragm gets messed up. And you really, with singing, you want your whole torso to work like a kind of violin body and have good vibration. And so you can't sit. And if you stand for 5 or 6 hours, you're tired because standing is tiring to the legs. Sitting isn't so great for the back. So they've worked out a fabulous compromise, which we should revisit. And that compromise is that if you see here, this is a seat. But what you can't see very well is that there's a little metal track here. See that, but you can see this little thing that's carved there in the bottom of that seat? when the seat is flipped up, that little gizmo becomes a seat up here, just big enough to catch your two sit bones. And it puts you in this position. Not this, and not this, but halfway between sitting and standing. And that way you rest the legs, but you also have a full open torso. So it has the benefits of both and the negatives of neither. And we're going to see that, how important that is. But first, we'll just continue our little zoom through history. 18th century is where most furniture designers say it's all wonderful. They like the fact that there's a little attention to the body because there's padding on the seat. The front rail is rounded. The sizing here it's worked out visually. So they like the fact that there's attention to human comfort and visual refinement. And a lot of visual symbolic expression is possible in the backs. They don't like what happened in the 19th century. With the invention of spring coil upholstery and industrial weaving, you get to have fabric, which was expensive in the old days, and you get this doing, springy stuff. And they don't like it because today, from the vantage point of 20th century aesthetics, we don't like it because you don't see how it's made. It's hidden. And I'd say from a body point of view, it's also not so good because when you sit on something that's too soft, weight is meant to go down through bones. But when you sit on something that's too soft, the sit bones sink down and the cushion comes up around it and you press on the flesh. Flesh is not designed for load bearing. Bones are, but not flesh. So you don't want to cup the buttocks, basically. We did like this thing from the 19th century, the thonnet. He figured out how to steam wood and to be able to make these fantastic curves. So here, the structure is the decoration. So modernists love this because structure, form and function and symbolic expression are all become the same. Then the 20th century rolls around, and I argue that this is a century of experimentation with new materials, with very little regard for the poor human body. So this is by Marcel Breuer, German architect. One day he has an aha moment that steel has been invented, so there's these strong tubing that's now on the scene, and bicycles have been invented and use it. And he sees a bicycle whiz by and goes, wow, why can't I do that with a chair? And so he did. The first one is named after his daughter, Francesca. It's called the Seska, and this is named after his painter friend, Vasily Kandinsky. It's called the Vasily. And it's not so great for body. It's interesting, though, for materials. Then, not to be outdone, Mies van der Rohe designs this famous chair for the Barcelona Pavilion in Spain. And it's often said to be sort of like that Greek klizmos because it has an X in it. But this is very, very deep. And so there's no way you can lean back and use the back and have your leg bend. Either your leg has to stick straight out, or you have to slump in order to use the bend. So I thought he must have been a really long-thighed man. So I looked up pictures of him, and indeed, he's a very tall man. So probably his thigh was long enough to use this, but for most of us, it's a no-go. The other problem with it is that this reverses your lumbar curve. So it's really, and it's very hard to get out of and so forth. Anyway, mid-20th century, 3 Argentinian architects designed this, a kind of a bag. Seems like that would be comfy, but it's probably not so great for the organs to be in a bag, to collapse on top of one another. They're better open and expanded on a planar surface. New material hits the scene after World War II. Saarinen and others are enamored with the new plastic resins, and so they make this so-called organic chair. It wins a prize in the MoMA competition for an organic chair, and I guess it's called organic because it has curves, but I think that it's actually better for the organism to work against planar surfaces rather than echo ours, because when you echo ours, then we turn in on ourselves. If you have something planar, say here's your rib cage, let's say, and if it's against something planar, it slightly opens. If it's wrapped, it slightly condenses on itself. Same with the pelvis. When you sit, now these are your hip wings, and here are your sit bones. And if you're on something curved, you go in slightly. If you're on something planar, you have an opportunity to open slightly. And then the Swedes get in, oh look, ma, no, both one piece of wood, both back and seat. So it's a kind of tour de force with using a traditional material like wood with the metal legs, but it's still not better for the body. And here is something else in the Museum of Modern Art. Everything I've just showed you is in fact in the Museum of Modern Art, but here it's an experiment with plasticity. It doesn't have much to do with the body, nor do these inflatables. Now, just in case you are so inclined to go to the beach and you want to retain your status as a civilized human being, you can take these so that you can sit up to read the New York Times at the beach. No lying, no rolling around on the sand like an animal. No, no, no. Civilization requires uprightness, at least we think right now. So, where did I get this jaundiced view? Well, let's see, let's go back here. I gotta move. A friend of mine taught English in Africa, and I was visiting her and looking at these photos after my first year of Alexander training, and I was looking at their head-neck relationships because that's what is really key in that technique. And I said, oh, they're like us, some of them are in better and worse shape. And then there was this guy who stood out, and he was elegant, and his face led, but his neck was not dragged forward. His neck was still getting support from the spine. His chest was deep. His arms were not pinched forward in clerical stoop, nor back in military excess. They were right off the midline. He was perfect. And there was one other guy who looked like him. Awesome. My friend, who didn't know anything about my burgeoning interest in chairs, says, that's funny. The two you picked are two that came from a village that never had a missionary school, so they never sat in tables and chairs. Do you hear the trumpets? I mean, for me, it was like, dun, 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 the birth of a hypothesis. It's not good chair design or bad chair design. There's something wrong with chairs. What is it? I didn't know what it was yet, but I was resolved to go back to the literature and figure it out. So I started reading medical rehab literature and ergonomic stuff more closely and this and that, and discovered that, yes, indeed, there's a whole list of things that are caused by sitting in chairs. And what I've learned is that when we sit at right angles, the pelvis, these muscles here, which attach to the back of our pelvis, are under tension, so it tips the pelvis back, and that flattens the lumbar curve. Standing, we have the double set of curves that we should have. And the good news is, halfway between, we keep the spine in this good relationship. And in outer space, when you float around without any gravitational force on your body, this is what happens. This is neutral, and NASA calls it neutral body posture. This is where the musculature on the front balances the musculature on the back. So there's very good reason why this is such a great position. And here's a guy really doing it. Now, an American surgeon looked at what happens to the lumbar spine. Have you ever heard of somebody having a slip disc? How many have ever heard of that? A slip disc, yeah. Well, slip discs always go backwards. They never go forwards. Because when we reverse this lumbar curve, the two vertebrae get too close together. They put pressure on the front of the disc, and it goes backwards, and it bumps into nerve, and it's real painful. So he was interested in figuring it out, and he looked at figuring out, what leads to this. And guess what? Lying down on your side, it's in the nicest possible posture. That's A above there. And then it gets worse as you go down here. The only thing that's worse than sitting proper is sitting with your legs up or bending over. But see here, squatting is better than sitting. But this is one of the reasons we all probably unconsciously move into that slump position, because it kind of helps us get into that 135 relationship between torso and thigh. Here's a poor guy in New York City trying to make use of a chair. The chair designer, like the ones you're sitting on, the chair designer has canted the front of the seat up so that you can stop that forward slide that I was talking about. But then if you cant the front up to stop that forward slide, then you have an angle less than 90 degrees, so they open the back. Just what we shouldn't. Anyway, and when you open the back like this, what happens? If you accept the trajectory established by this, his head should be about here. But obviously that's untenable. So he brings his head forward naturally. But the spine is still going backwards. So what happens? Here we go, da-da-da-da. And then suddenly there's this big curve here to get to the middle of his neck. So in time, he may develop a dowager's hump. And we'll say, oh, well, you have to get old somehow. And we'll attribute to age something which has nothing to do with age. It has to do with use, consistent use. So it's a cultural artifact. The cultural artifact of the chair is going to create this health problem. Oh, here we go. That's how we're supposed to be, okay? Instead, we have, we think this is comfortable. We insist still on this myth of the right angle posture, but there's the reality below. Reform comes to this scene. People do figure this out. The Danish doctor Mandel was the first to write about this. And so he and Peter Opsvik, a Norwegian designer, come up with this kneeling chair. How many have ever been in a kneeling chair? Oh boy, very few. I guess its day has come and gone. Well, it is true, remember, that this is good. But we have an investment in tables and desks at this height. So if I'm going to perch, this is too low. I need to raise this up. And so we say, oh, it's too much to have to get both a new chair and a new table. Too much. So I'll just go back to this. So culture is conservative. And this shows us how we get locked in. But these guys said, okay, well, if this is beneficial, how about if we lower our body in space, and we'll do it by kneeling. And then we can keep this open angle, but still use this. So this thing has been called the most radical chair design of the 20th century, but it's actually profoundly conservative because it's trying to conserve the investment that we have in tables at that height. So it's not great to have weight on your knees. It's not great to lose proprioceptive feedback from the soles of your feet. But it was an effort. Now he went on, same guy, Opsvik, O-P-S-V-I-K, went on to design this Capisco chair, which allows you to be high and your thighs drop through those eroded corners so you can be in the perched position. And there I am in one in my own house. Whoops. And physioballs, Italian physioballs, have been recruited into the problem of chair reform. Swedish nurses are taught never to bend over, always to use this position of mechanical advantage. But what that would mean, we've got problems with our sinks. I found one that was good that everybody says, yeah, but I like to use it for storage. Well, this one was good because it had knee space and it had storage. So I recommend it to you future designers. Well, we're in a rush here. So size variation is what I'm arguing for, even in public places. This is Sweden, and even here, it's a little height different, both in the stool and the shelf. Why not? This guy designed this thing. You can tell it's an 80s design. He thought it was really cool, even though his knees are way higher than his hips, so he's rounding his own lower back, and it's way too deep for her. But he didn't care because he thought it looked cool. Now, this is a problem that design is heir to, thinking things look cool sometimes and forgetting about how they're supposed to serve us and particularly our bodies. So, mama bear, papa bear, baby bear sizes, why not? Shakers did it. Mandel came up with this idea to reform school furniture. Why not bring back the old-fashioned footstool as a way to create size variation in our environments? And let's not forget the other end of the spine, the head-neck connection. Bologna, their art students work on sloped surfaces, not flat, which helps that head-neck connection. This is a tool, Levenger's Tools for Serious Readers. Anybody ever seen that catalog? No? I guess it's not. Anyway, this is what to do when you're tired, rather than going to have coffee, you should do this. You should lie down on a flat surface with your knees up. But of course that creates problems for women. There's gender issues. When you lie down in public, people wonder. A student of mine liked this so much, he set up his desk on the floor, and that's his rest position place. Once again, obspic, here we are. He wants you to be able to use his kneeling chair and also to use it conventionally, but what I like is this. Because look, when you take, if this is bad and this is good, and you rotate this in space, what do you get? A lounge chair. Something we should all embrace and take into our culture. This is a famous one designed by Corbusier and Charlotte Perriand. I have to say her, I always mention her because all his other chairs are lousy, but this one is great, and it must be because of her. The Finns were the first people to decouple the keyboard from the computer and to use the lounge position for computing. So I'm following them there. And now the latest and the greatest, and the most sad, I've talked to you about the biomechanical problems of seating and the problems for morphological development. Recent research that was published in the Scientific American in January 2011 on vast data sets from Australia, Canada, New York, US, and elsewhere shows that there are metabolic problems also associated with seating, and they are serious. They have discovered that sitting more than 3 hours a day leads to increased rates of mortality from all causes, heart attack, cancer, and stroke. And these effects are greater than being old, fat, or get this one, a smoker. It's worse to sit than to smoke. And the mechanism is that when we sit, something muscular stuff doesn't fire, and the pancreas, an organ like about here, quits producing an important enzyme that the liver needs to produce fats. So undigested fats go to the liver, it's overwhelmed, and that's how we get all these various evil diseases. Enzymes that help break down the fat drop by 90%. It's called lipase, L-I-P-A-S-E. So now we really have to get out of chairs, okay? So here's one way to do it. This is focal upright out of Rhode Island. San Francisco guy figured out how to ride his bike to work and then lock it into place while he works. Reading, resting, okay, my own place, okay. A bathtub, he mentioned I did a bathtub, there it is. More obspic. Move, that's the main thing, move. So rockers, we need to valorize rockers and get rockers back into our lives. When I worked at Anderson Ranch Art Center, we tried to do high-style body-conscious chair design, and this was kind of the top of that class. So you can perch in a couple of ways and move. One guy wanted a rocker, but he said apartments are too small for rockers, so he wanted a collapsible rocker. So there he is with his 2 collapsible rockers. I wanted to create a room when I did my Alexandra training in New York where I would very seldom sit. So I had no chairs, I only had stools, I went cold turkey. So I had a stand-up place for my phone over there. And then here's Harvard Graduate School of Design. It used to have these carpeted stairs. I don't know if it still does. And here was a project, a landscape project, where students proposed sculpting the land to support the that position. Project I did in San Francisco for a seat exhibit, sort of a wooden version of the Korb chair. And I think I'm ending on this image where ecology and body come together. The problem here in Santa Barbara was that people were coming to the cliff edge to sit with six-packs and watch the sun go down, and inadvertently the cliff edge was eroding. So the powers that be hired an architect and an artist to make it just a little bit more attractive to sit 30 feet back from the cliff edge. They could have put up a cyclone fence or something stupid like that, but they were smart and they just made it more attractive to sit a little further back. So they have almost a perfect lounge. They need to have it bent under the knee. But anyway, here with a friend, you can have your six-pack, you're elevated enough, your eyes are up enough that you can see the sun go down. So I like to think that body-conscious design and ecological design can hold hands, and that, in fact, being more sensitive to the needs of our own body will possibly help us be more sensitive to the needs of the earth that allows us all to be here in the first place. Thank you.
Thank you. And to our custom design chairs that we have done just for your visit.
I can teach you how to make the best use of a bad chair. If you sit back here, you slump.
Yeah.
If you way out here at the very edge, you can take turns getting one knee lower than the other, like going into that 135-degree thing.
I see. Half at a time.
Yeah, because you can't really do both or you'll fall down, but you can at least do this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, so we've already learned what U.S. News and World Report would call news we can use, how to occupy a chair that is imperfectly designed. Well, I started my introduction of you with this notion of empathy, just because we've used these 5 words as a kind of the sort of design thinking mantra, as a glue to hold together our disparate guests. But it seems especially true in your case that empathy is the it's not 20% of each of these words. It's like 90% empathy, it seems to me.
I liked that when you said that. I thought, ooh, he figured that out? You know, like, ooh. I didn't know it was a word you were using for everybody. But yeah, I think I am trying to teach empathy. If you have empathy for yourself, starting with empathy for yourself and appreciating your own pains, and then you can appreciate that maybe other people are not comfortable.
Right. Well, you know,
and then of course there's the empathy with the earth that I've mentioned
well,
at the end.
And which we can, well, I'm a compartmentalizer, so let's disaggregate things so that we can see if we can understand them even more thoroughly. Just to something that everyone in the room knows, because these are words that we've used all the time. We use kind of the language of design thinking, so it's empathy, define, ideate, prototype, and test, a kind of cyclical set of terms. And empathy is so important at the beginning because the premise is, in order to design anything, you have to truly understand the world from the perspective of the person who's going to use it. And in your case, it is to understand the body of the person, if I'm hearing you right, to understand the body of the person who's going to use it. But you did give, I loved that you gave a kind of historical overview of the evolution of the chair, because it makes the context for where we are now all the clearer. And part of that historical overview, it seems to me, really you could look at each of those examples of chairs, whether you didn't show the one of my greatest hits for kind of the opposite of physical comfort, which is Rietveld's chair, the de Stijl chair, only because it's entirely about rhetoric and maybe not at all about the body?
Well, surprise. I actually think because of its planar qualities,
and because
of its angle, and because it doesn't, if you're going to be taken off balance, you don't want to have no head support, because then you end up doing this and collapsing in your chest. That Rietveld chair goes all the way back up and supports the head, so that if you're going to go into that position, you're not obliged to distort your head and neck. Ironically, it is actually better than some of the
ones that would appear to be
soft and cushy and nice.
Well, actually, you know, really one of the things that your presentation gives us is a way to objectively test some of these things that we have always simply internalized as, well, you find that comfortable and I find this comfortable. And this is a, finding ways to objectively test designs is, of course, part of this process, it seems to me. Because once you empathize with somebody as to what their need is, then the second stage is to define what problem is it that we are trying to solve. And clearly, the different chairs that you showed, as you cited, were attempting to solve very different problems. One might have been about social hierarchy. Another one might have been about other things. But I wanted to, before we left, I think we'll have a fair amount to talk about with regard to empathy, but I just jotted down some notes about, you can have empathy, in designing a chair, you can have empathy for the user, you can have empathy for the culture, because it struck me that that was certainly something that you were talking about. You can have empathy for the task. Certainly there are chairs that are better suited for one task than another. You can have empathy for the economics of the situation, like we're not, I don't know, we're not going to make it entirely out of gel because that's too expensive, for example. But what are some other criteria that you might have stumbled upon as you were looking at chairs and the evolution of them? Hierarchy, culture, user, task. I guess I said economics. Maybe I just mean economy.
Well, the not wanting to have to buy make new work surfaces is an example of the economy.
Sure.
So the kneeling chair gets invented so that we can still use this.
Yes, yes.
That would be a good example.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. Well, then, moving on to defining the problem, which we're going to have a whole assignment in this course about how people, how different designers that have been guests talk about defining or understanding the problem, because I think most designers would agree that oftentimes clients they come to you and they say, I need here's a picture of a house I saw in Atlanta and this is what I need. And after you talk to them a little bit and you find out what they think that house that they're showing you the picture of is going to do for them, and you realize it's not going to do it at all, and in fact they need a very, very different house. And that's all about not understanding the problem and racing to solution.
Yes.
And I guess that must happen a lot in furniture, even in the age of ergonomic knowledge. I see so much office furniture, so much so-called task seating, that they can't all be right. I mean, they kind of have the rhetoric of science, right? They're not overstuffed easy chairs of the 19th century. They're the opposite. They are anthropomorphic things that appear to have spines themselves. But you say many of those maybe are not.
Well, I've talked to the designers of those fancy chairs, and they well, like, if you really are going to have a higher surface, higher chair, your lumbar curve comes back into place automatically, and so you don't need what's called lumbar support. And those designers, I say, well, you're designing a chair that can be raised up, you have a waterfall front edge so the legs can do this. Why do you have lumbar support? They say, because the market isn't ready to give up lumbar support. They think that a good chair has to have lumbar support. Now, think about it. When you go into this position, that is what reverses your lumbar curve. So then the designers of the ergonomic types say, oh, well, we better have lumbar support to push this curve back into place. You try to push it into place, but then most of us sit on chairs to do forward-oriented work, so we don't sit back into this thing. And then the designer gets all indignant. They're not using the chair right. They're not sitting in here to use my lumbar support. But you don't need to be pushed forward if you already have your lumbar curve. But this because they say, oh, the market isn't ready. The Aeron chair, the most famous of the fancy chairs, has a lumbar curve. Even though it could be used, you could set it to be high enough up and rotate the seat pan forward enough that you'd have this, and you'd have your curve. You don't need any external pushing.
I have an Aeron chair in my office, and I was thinking about that today before you arrived. I sat back in it all the way, and I thought, well, this is comfortable, but I can't imagine that I would do any work like this, unless perhaps I put the monitor on the ceiling, or did some other fairly radical revisions to my office, and made it, appear that I was at the dentist when people came into my office. So that's interesting. Which leads me, by the way, to it's one thing to talk about task seating, and certainly there are a lot of other kinds of seating, and I want to talk to you about some different, let's say, archetypes or prototypes or furniture types, seating types. Couches, but the first thing I want to ask you about is airline seating, because it seems to me no place is seating more controversial, and today more than ever. If those of you who are following the news, I think you probably know that people have been recently, 3 or 4 people have been pulled in handcuffs from airlines because they've been battling over knee space between the. I'm not making this up. These are people being dragged from airplanes by the law. So the question is, there is a perfect, it seems to me, opportunity for a radical redesign of how this is considered. Have you or any of the people you've encountered in this realm gotten onto that subject at all?
Yeah, we've tried. I had a high school friend who worked for Continental Airlines, and I wrote to them. They figured it out for first class. That they've done a good job there.
Sure.
But for us in the cattle car, that they don't care, and it's crazy. And I blame the ergonomics profession, or the early standards that were established very early on. The sort of father of ergonomics is a Swiss guy called Etienne Grandjean. And he said, okay, we know that it's, he said, we don't know what comfort is, because everybody has a different idea about comfort. So we'll look for something objective, and that would be no muscular work. So that would mean a collapse. And then he says, but we know that that produces discs, slip discs. So we'll push the lumbar curve forward. But notice I'm still keeping the forward droop. So this looks like an airline seat, doesn't it? Exactly like an airline seat, where your head is pushed forward and you're in this horrible position. So I lay it at their feet.
Right.
I'm trying to promote what I call somatics. It's not my word. It's people who are interested in techniques like Feldenkrais and Alexander and Rolfing and all those mind-body practices where culture and psychology and physiology work together. That I would like to see more somatic people involved in these disciplines, the design disciplines.
It struck me, and I think I've heard something about this, when you were showing those great convertible church singing chairs. I forget the
Misericord, but yeah, singing chair. I like that.
Yes, I mean, and I don't know. I saw the slide was a little dark on this screen, but on my computer I saw it earlier, and the idea is really simple. That there's a flat chair that you would sit in, more or less like this, and then you flip the seat up, and then you're in this sort of 135-degree position. And we've seen there are things like that sometimes. At waiting lounges, at airports or at bars or things like that, where
Paris Metro has them.
Yeah. That's right. I've seen them on the subway system. That's exactly right. Well, it seems to me that I read something about one of the airlines, purely for predatory economic reasons, but nevertheless, it's an interesting idea, said, well, what if on short flights we had that kind of leaning thing? It would give us a lot more space, but it might actually be much more comfortable. Ironically, because
I know everyone goes, oh, those terrible airlines, they're always trying to get more, money. Well, yeah, but also it would be physiologically, you'd get off the plane not feeling like hell.
Right. Now, the interesting problem to be solved, if I could focus on this defining things, on an airline seat, is it has a couple of purposes, I suppose. One is to be comfortable for a 3-hour flight, reading, eating, being able to get up and get out over somebody else. But also, I guess, safety and stability and rigidity in turbulence, or God help us, in something more dramatic than turbulence. And I wonder, I would love to see a kind of cross-pollinated list of those two sets of performance criteria.
Yeah,
that's how I would approach that.
I think it's very good, and it'd be a good design problem.
Yeah.
And if you get good results, let's go to the airlines.
Yeah. I mean, this course is about helping these folks, many of whom are engineers, understand how to frame complex problems. Oftentimes we get, when we're learning how to be a designer, and I would say even more so learning how to be an engineer, you get discrete problems that are focusing on optimizing for a single variable, right? Make this truss with the least amount of steel. If you do that, you get an A. But what if there are 8 other variables, actually, like in real life? And you have to learn how to, in a somewhat rational or repeatable methodology, okay, how do I approach this sort of thing? One way is to make lists against the different criteria and see where there's common stuff so that you can maybe start to synthesize. You're never going to optimize 100% for all of, optimizing the airline seat for safety might be, I don't know, a cocoon of some kind, or,
Well, you need something behind the head so that you'd stop whiplash.
That's it. And isn't that probably why that thing tilts forward?
Oh, it doesn't have to push that far forward.
No.
I mean, there should be, ideally some adjustability for individual differences, but then it should then lock into place so that if there were a sudden jolt, it wouldn't unlock and push you forward or do something weird.
Yeah.
So that might be a bit expensive, getting that mechanism just right.
Well, I remember seeing an interview with Robert Crandall, who was a very famous CEO of American Airlines. Like, maybe he transformed the airline industry, reservation systems and everything. But I think he maybe retired like 20 years ago. But there was a great interview of him on a news show where a fresh-faced, enthusiastic interviewer said, "So, Mr. Crandall, when are we going to get more legroom on the airplanes?" And he replied, completely dour and unpleasant. He said, "As soon as you start shopping for airline tickets based solely on price." And she was sort of arrested by this, but one takes the point. That is, as long as we are actually responsible for the increasing diminution of the space on an airplane, as long as what we say is the only thing that matters to us when we buy an airline ticket is how low the price is, because then we're going to get as many people on that airplane as we can. Anyway, the point is, that is yet another variable in this conversation, lest they devolve into good versus evil.
Right.
Now, I noticed towards the end of your presentation when you were talking about an actual design studio that was making the collapsible rocker, or maybe, I don't know the exact context there, but were people trying to, was there more than one person trying to solve that problem?
No. The idea was for each student picked their own kind of chair and said, okay, I want to do something stylish that is body conscious.
Right.
That was, and that could be interpreted any way. So his style, I suppose, was that he hand painted on those rockers.
Yeah.
He made woodland scenes.
Right. Okay, well, let's stipulate that you and I both probably would have been happier if there had been some other more integral aspect of personalizing that design.
Well, the personalizing, we really wanted it, we advertised the course as high style body conscious. So the first one was, I think, very high style. The one with the 2 ways to perch, that's 3 people in that scene. It was like a real cubist
It looked very cubist.
It looks very, slick and interesting, right? The other one looks like a rocker, so it's harder for it to be zingy.
Well, but what I was going to get at was that the prototyping, to get back to this sort of cycle of design, where we come up with, we think we understand the problem to be solved, we've empathized with a user In this case, someone who wants to sit properly and be mobile, but in a very small space. So a regular rocker is too big, so we need a collapsible rocker. Okay, so now we've made this prototype.
Yeah.
How did you feel that was? You probably didn't have enough time in this course to do a bunch of iterations of that. Yeah.
It was a 2-week intensive course.
Right.
I mean, it was residential course. It's fun if you ever want to go to Anderson Ranch Arts Center and work on a problem in a course on different art topics for 2 weeks and eat and sleep there. It's fun.
Yeah, I guess what I'm getting at is, with any of these other chairs, let's say the chairs that have come to market, the number of iterations that something like the Aeron chair went through before it is the one that's in my office, 100, I suspect. You know what I mean? You'd have to, even with digital tools, to be very precise in measuring human dimensions and so forth. You make the prototype, and then somebody sits in it and works in it for 5 hours. And they say, "Oh boy, here are the 5 major problems that we have." And then how do we? That's really kind of that's a process that I think those of us who have been involved with architecture are very familiar with. But it's one that I think is useful, and I think the literature says it's very useful in designing products of all kinds, software, whatever it is that you're designing. That cycle is essential.
Yes.
When it comes to testing, I loved that, we've already talked about this a little bit, but I loved that you were very specific about this underlying geometric reality, about how these different geometries work with the body. Is that I assume is widely accepted in the furniture making world? Even if they come to conclusions like, well, the market isn't ready for,
there's no debate about the facts. The debate is about, is the culture ready?
Yeah. Well, wasn't,
I mean, I have to say, when the book came out in '98, they said it wasn't ready. But now, I just went to Ergo Expo last December of 13, and wow, even Steelcase has a treadmill now as a desk, as a workstation, where you set it at a slow speed, and you stand up, and there you are, working away. Now, I went to Steelcase in '99, those early years, and they told me the market wasn't ready. But 14 years later, bingo, the market seems to be ready. So everybody's getting on the bandwagon now of moving. And I think it wasn't my book that did it. I mean, people say, oh, I was prescient. And I think, not really. I just wasn't, it's just I had the guts to see the truth of this idea. So I don't think it was my book that has made this sea change. I think it was that data that came out in 2011 about death.
Well, the guy who lives above me, actually, in Cambridge, is a software guy who works from home, and he has the desk that you showed that maybe looked least realistic, maybe to our audience, but it's very real. He has a bicycle hooked up with his rear wheel raised up, so he cycles in his dining room, working at a desk that's up high.
Yeah.
The only downside is perhaps for the person who lives immediately below him.
You hear him. You hear him cycling.
And if he wants to work till 2 o'clock in the morning, it's an issue. Nevertheless, he seems to be very healthy and very fit.
Can he work on a rubber mat we're working with him on this problem?
Well, yeah, I think once again, this is a problem to be solved.
It's a design problem.
It is, absolutely. I find so many things are.
Yeah.
If you approach them that way, and then once you frame something as a design problem, actually, it suggests that there's a solution to it, as opposed to we're at an impasse because we disagree.
Yeah.
It's very true. Actually, I'm very involved with the public review process on large real estate development projects in the city, architects and developers and the public and the government and so forth. And almost everyone comes to these meetings certain, with a high level of certainty, that the outcome that they have in mind is absolutely the best and really the only one that's in the public interest.
Yeah.
And by disaggregating those thoughts into disparate individual items, I find that you can get people, even large groups, to think like designers and assess on the merits, once you've disaggregated them out of a worldview and into just little events like how tall should that cornice be, or something like that. It's surprising how much this sort of breaking things apart, assessing them, and then reassembling them. It's surprising
and
how
viewing
effective
conflict as a design problem. Like, how can we maximize these two variables? You know, what is the, you know, rather than my word or, you know, my way or your way.
Yes.
Like how, yeah, it's a good idea to talk about it as a design problem.
Yes, and people, by the way, like the idea of design. Even if they aren't designers themselves, they like the idea that, yes, I would like to design something. Well, then let's work together. We'll design this cool thing called a solution to your problem. Mm-hmm. Doesn't always work, but it's a frame of reference. Mm-hmm. You know, full confession, I have read about your book. I have not read your book, but the historical references to the cultural role of the chair. How do you know, your interest now seems very much to be about, or the focus that came out of your work on the chair seems to be very ergonomic and health oriented.
I'd like to think it's somatic, but yes, I'll accept that merger of those two.
Well, but would you agree that then seems to have moved past some of the other variables that are present?
No, I want to change culture. I'm very interested in culture still. I want to make it okay to lie down in public. I want to make it okay to care about your comfort at work. I want to make it good to have meetings where you stand or walk. You know, the famous building in New Jersey, Bell Labs, they had an interior corridor that was wide enough for 4 people to walk around in this big rectangle, internal pathway around they had like an atrium or something. Anyway, they thought that, they knew that way back in the day that people think well when they move. Right. And
so have walking meetings.
So walking meetings. I mean, I want I'm really interested in culture. I just want to change it.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting. I mean, I guess it's reasonable, though, to ask, when you look at I mean, I think it's a very good example, by the way, and there's a fellow out here named Michael Kubo, who's a PhD student in architecture, who's written about a few of the sort of early research lab buildings, and things they either did accidentally or on purpose, I think initially accidentally, that ended up creating spaces for collaboration that sometimes weren't even intended.
Really?
Corridors that were wide enough that suddenly...
Oh, I thought the corridor thing there was planned.
Well, it may very well be in the example you're giving, but this guy he talks about a few different other, there's another one out on the...
Get him to come to EDRA. Tell him to present his findings at EDRA.
We'll compare notes on that. But the rhetorical role of chairs and furniture and the dining table that you described so well, that, you know, when you think about you know, I think I grew up in a household that had a dining room that had exactly the furniture you just described. Most of the chairs were armless. There were 1 or 2,
sometimes 2, at each end sometimes.
Had arms on them. And, you know, how does, you know, and I guess what I'm getting at it, how do we, and do we want to, but how do we translate some of that cultural legibility about social order, about family structure, about anything else? I'm not taking a position about whether one is good or bad, but when it becomes entirely about, let's say, performance on an ergonomic stage, isn't that a little bit like buildings that are entirely about, let's say in a certain period, representing their structure, honesty in structure, Do you see where I'm going?
Yeah, I do. Where's the role for symbolic expression?
Is there a way to solve? Are there ones that solve both problems at the same time? You know.
Well, I'll just. Well, first place, I can imagine if you had all the chairs identical, you could have one with a bow on it, or I mean, some kind of applied emblem or decoration that comes to mind. Right. Then I want to tell you what I do in my house, which is I have one of every different of these interesting new chairs, the Peter Obstvik, the Mandel, the this, that, the other, the German swapper, the on and on. And my guests each choose which one they want to play with, i.e., or sit on for the meal. Right. So that's another approach where you just, you have maybe every chair different, rather than having to differentiate one from the others. But I think, personally, I probably think that's one of the roles of art, is to differentiate, personalize, I don't know, maybe...
render culturally specific.
Yeah, it could be that the one chair is the same, doesn't have the arms, but maybe it's made out of a different material even.
Right.
Maybe it's gold.
Right. Well, there's so many, when we do get beyond the individual chair, which does lend itself to, when we're talking about the individual chair, it does lend itself to the individual body and the relationship between the individual body and the individual chair, and that's why I completely understand the sort of focus on ergonomic things. But I think it would be interesting, and I don't know if you or others look into this, it would be interesting if you think about Frank Lloyd Wright's, some of his famous dining tables, which had a real kind of sociology between the chairs and the table and the space they made that was intimate around the table within a larger room. The same can be said of a living room arrangement. There's something about comfort, sure. There's something about designing for conversation that is different from the task-oriented thing of work or the survival-oriented thing of airline travel. And I just wonder, have you seen, because when I think about it, I don't think of the same level of ergonomic development in things like couches or shared furniture.
Yeah, couches are really difficult if you want one that you're going to sit up in. Usually they're kind of low, they cut you off halfway. But the reason I like couches, or I appreciate their real social role, is they make it legitimate to lie down in the public spaces of the home.
Right.
Everybody uses a couch to lie down, to watch TV, or to whatever. I mean, it's only if there's multiple people there, maybe you don't. But it's really a bed. And we don't put beds in living rooms, but we do put sofas, because we think of it, it's not a bed, but it functions as a bed.
Well, speaking of beds, of course, that is where this whole world, for good or ill, and I don't know how scientifically supported it is, because all I see about the changing role of beds is from marketing. But the transition just in the last 10 years from our mattress is slightly firmer or, more reliable than the other guys to beds that do every possible thing you could ever want. I wonder if there's probably not the same level of connection to ergonomic reality as there is in these chair analyses.
Yeah, I must say I haven't read the literature on that. Just as a person, what I got persuaded by the idea that if you lie on your side, you should be a little softer under the shoulder and a little softer under the hip so that the spine can remain horizontal. I bought into that without having any absolute review of the literature to know that that's correct. It makes sense to me from a somatic point of view that I don't want my spine doing that.
Right. Well,
it's another book for somebody else. One of you guys could become the expert on sleep.
Well, what is really interesting here, and again, people trained in architecture see this more clearly, I think, or just it's more in the foreground, is that the difference between the performance of something and its appearance are, those are foregrounded issues in architecture. Absolutely. There's a certain set of responses to a problem that architecturally that you would have if all you were concerned with was efficient operation within a building. You might lay it out one way. But it might end up looking like no building that has ever existed before, and it might, on a campus, for example, it might look ridiculous. It might look
well, that would be the rationalist, remember the Leon Creer rationalist.
Well, that would be maybe be almost the other end of the spectrum, which is a type, a specific sort of historical referential type as one, I guess I'd say, is one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is a building that expands and contracts and to meet whatever idiosyncratic program it has. So, like, I don't know, like certain kinds of brutalist buildings that just express themselves in whatever way they need to, and then very buttoned down, historical architecture.
Since I work in a brutalist building on the UC Berkeley campus, I would say it was not a free not free of
that's
ideas.
Probably not a good example.
It's hard to think of buildings that are completely free of culturally ordering ideas that are just like basically behavior diagrams.
Right. Well, the clearest examples probably are post-war experimental schools where they really felt like they were going to reinvent what schools were. I'm thinking about CRS and the sort of 60s.
Caudill, Rowlett, and Scott?
Yeah, Caudill, Rowlett, and Scott. Schools where they, the windowless school, these weren't all good ideas, but they were willing to try something that looked completely different, and it was a culturally important building. It wasn't just like some private club somewhere. This is our town's school, and they were willing to I think
our better examples probably come from animal husbandry. Like chicken coops.
Yeah. Well,
and maybe, although there's human convenience that's factored into that equation, it's hard to think of buildings that are absolutely devoid of cultural ordering.
Well, certain factory buildings that have had additions over the years, probably, which is the same idea as the chicken coop, where we're adding another. We got a new piece of equipment. It's 8 times as big as the last one, so we're building a big sort of carbuncle on the back of this thing, and then later we'll put a long, low piece here for a conveyor belt. And I mean that you're right. I didn't come armed with some really good.
That ad hocism,
Ad hoc and sequential.
Yeah.
Evolutionary kind of thing.
Yeah.
As opposed to the completely ordered singular idea.
Yeah.
So, but that inside out versus outside in kind of thing that we think about all the time in architecture is probably not as foregrounded in the world of furniture, although one could look at it that way. Is that fair to say?
I think I think you definitely can look at it that way. It makes. Look at that kid, who designed a thing that didn't even work for himself, but that had that look, the 80s look.
You're talking, just to remind the students, there was a girl sitting with her legs straight out because she couldn't.
And the guy was sitting there with his jacked up like this, which really reverses his lumbar curve. And he didn't care.
Right.
So the look was the thing.
Right.
I think that's still a big issue.
Well,
inside out or outside in.
It's a big issue for everybody in this room when they buy clothing.
Absolutely.
You know what? How many of you bought something that you thought looked really cool, and it didn't keep you warm?
Or it hurt.
Or rain penetrated it in an instant, or these sorts of things. Or a really cool pair of shoes. Wow, these are so great. I'm dying inside. Right? The pain is so great. We have to stop for a drink right now, not because it's recreation, but because I need it for medicinal purposes. We've all done this. So this outside in and inside out thing is extremely real. And I think it's another lens that we'll be looking at things that we talk about in this course through, because it's actually true in almost everything.
Almost everything.
Yeah.
Even definitely with women's clothing and shoes and how shapely, how tight, how this, how that.
No.
Oh my God.
No.
It's really, but even men's clothes. You know, I do a shoe problem in my class, Body Conscious Design. Every week I teach something new to expand experiential sensory awareness. And so we start with the foot, and we do some stuff that increases your awareness of one foot, and then we stand and we compare the 2 feet, and they're radically different. And then they do a shoe problem that is not anatomically harmful, but has to be fashionable. Right. So I put together those two completing things.
Right, right.
And you know, the male students also learn that their shoes are too tapered. For some reason, culturally, we want to all think that we have elegantly tapered feet. And in fact, our feet flare a little bit. Have you ever seen anybody who grew up in Hawaii? Anybody ever seen that? How their feet look like hands? They go out at the edge. Because all of us have the little toe deformed. It's a little tiny version of Chinese foot binding. It's just, even the men. So the clothing contradictions here are really big.
It's very interesting. My trainer just insisted that I buy a new pair of workout shoes because I'd had the ones I had for 12 years, and he said, "Sir, that's long enough. You need to replace them." But I noticed these new Nike shoes actually widened significantly and had their shoe tongue in a different place. Anyway, it was the sort of ergonomics of it were super interesting. I also think about, and I'm sure there are people who teach courses on body conscious design that have more to do with clothing. And of course, you go back just maybe 100 years, the things we put women through with the mechanical, you know, would be called torture today.
Yeah, but you know, Cher just had some ribs removed so that she could have a more hourglass figure. So that issue is still with us today.
Right. Well, yeah, that's another story.
That's not design. Well, that's a kind of surgery as design. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well, do we have any questions from the audience?
I hope so.
Here we go.
Yay.
Yes, sir.
The ergonomic balls that you showed one of them in your slide, actually, but I didn't hear whether that's a good or a bad thing.
Well, they're good because they make you wiggle a little bit all the time, and so you're doing tiny bits of adjustment. Well, the caveat is they can lose air and sag, and then you get, you know, flesh turning into load bearing. So you've got to keep them pumped up, okay? But if they're stiff and pumped up, then they're good because unconsciously there's just a tiny bit of movement, and that means the legs are still doing some work, which is probably important for this metabolic business about the lipase and being produced by the pancreas and going to the liver. Okay. So just the fact that the legs are doing some load bearing it makes them good, and the fact that there's a little bit, tiny bit of instability means the spine is working. So the tiny, tiny little muscles that connect one vertebral body to the other, those are working. And that's a good thing. Okay. That helps keep you awake.
And a follow-up question, how about sofas that have the feet that recline out? The little foot stand that comes out and the back kind of goes back.
This is the Barcalounger question.
Yeah, it's not, those are great because they put you into this. And the advantage, you know, flat is nice, but you're looking up at the ceiling and you don't have any eye contact with people as they come in the room. The advantage of this is that you get that open angle between thigh and trunk, and your head is up, so you can, and your eyes are out and about. You can talk to people when they come in the room.
Oh, this is great. So it turns out your grandfather was right. Just sitting back in the Barcalounger is actually a very good way to sit, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, you don't have the weight on your feet, though, so you still have to get out of that thing, and because, but I'm going to a conference on sedentary behavior next fall, at end of September, at University of Illinois, and I'm going to press those hardcore ergonomic type researchers on the issue of what happens to lipase production when we lie down? Because we know sleep is essential and good for us, and most of you are not getting enough if you're being, you know, at least in architecture, they don't get enough. Maybe it's more sane in your department. But anyway, the point is I want to find out if this position is closer to sleep metabolically, or if it's closer to doing nothing, and if it creates problems for this lipase production. That's my next big question.
Very good. Well, Galen, I want to thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Galen Cranz.
Thank you.